Welcome everybody to the second part of the Tacit Knowledge, Communities of Tacit Knowledge, Architecture and its Ways of Knowing in December the 6th today. And yeah, unfortunately, this lecture will be completely online. Here in Austria, we are now having the fourth lockdown and I guess the third chancellorship in just a couple of months. So things are changing very quickly here. However, due to the fact that we would like to have people also here physically here in Vienna, it might be very likely that the next lecture, which was announced for January, I just say that now here in the beginning, maybe everybody will hear it or will note that maybe or very likely it will take place only in March. So at the moment we are trying to find out how we organize the next lectures, hoping that at least in March and April we can invite people physically here to Vienna. Of course, we also tried it now with our two guests today, but unfortunately it is not possible. However, even if we only see each other online tonight, a particularly exciting topic awaits us nonetheless. The tacit connection between literature, or more generally, the narrative structures with architecture and the city, or maybe urban planning. On the one hand, it seems obvious that we structure our spatial thinking, our understanding of architecture according to narratives, so as we always do. But how does this really work? And is this a deep structure or deep structures? Or is it an instrument and a tool for thinking architecture in a different or maybe in a more obvious way? So there are many questions with this topic, and I'm really excited that we have two real experts on this topic. Both have studied architecture and also in the humanities, literature, or similar. It's Klaske Havik and Janina Gosseye, both working in Delft. I know that in the Netherlands today, I just realized that today is a high holiday in the Netherlands. It's Sinterklaas. And I remember very well when I came to the Netherlands, the first year I was there, I had to create a poem for one of my mates in the house we lived, and in Dutch, of course, which was really a challenging task for myself. So this is just an anecdote or an association. Before Klaske will start her lecture, I very briefly want to introduce you both, Klaske and Janina, to you. Klaske Havik is professor for methods of analysis and imagination at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at Delft University of Technology. She has done her focus in research is, as I said, is the relation between architectural and urban questions, and such as the use, experience, and imagination of place to literary language. She has published in 2014 her major book, or actually it's based on her PhD research, Urban Literacy, Reading and Writing in Architecture, which was then followed in 2016, Writing Place, Investigations in Architecture and Literature, and also she also co-edited together with Tom Abermatte and Hans Terz, Architecture Positions, Architecture, Modernity, and the Public Sphere. Klaske initiated also the platform Writing Place and organized the second international conference on architecture and fiction, Writing Place, Literary Methods in Architectural Research and Design, in 2013. And there's also a publication came out in 3 years later. And she also was the editor of Oase, a very influential Dutch-Belgian peer-reviewed architecture journal. And yes, I'm very happy, Klaske, that you will give us more insights in that really exciting topic. And Janina, I will introduce you later before your lecture starts, yeah? So I will hand over then to you. The stage is yours, Klaske. And yeah, I'm happy to have you here, at least online.
Thank you so much, Angelika, for your introduction and for the invitation to come to Vienna and speak to your students in the TACK network. Unfortunately, now online, but we'll make the best of it. I will try and share my screen.
Klaske, there is a noise, something maybe you have with your hands. You're coming.
Is it better now?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Perhaps I had my paper just in front of the mic. That could be. Is it better now? Okay, good. Let me know if there's any disturbance, and I will change something. So yes, in the previous 2 lectures by Tom Avermaet and Lara Schrijver about a month ago on the topic of tacit knowledge, they already introduced the topic quite extensively, and perhaps one of the key starting points of our investigation in tacit knowledge with this network is that this knowledge concerns, of course, knowledge that is embedded in ways of doing, in practices, and that as such, it's not expressed in theoretical language. It's in the habits, in the practices, in the objects, in the unspoken, that this kind of knowledge can be traced. And today I will talk with you about the notion of narrative, and I will explain how literary and spoken language may offer the kind of information about these practices, about these unspoken habits that we find in practices. And as a point of departure, let me take some insights that were also expressed in 2 of the articles we included in the first reader, the convolut, as we called it, together with our colleagues in Oslo and Stockholm for the first year of the network, our training axis on tacit knowledge. 2 of those papers that we included were those of Claudia Marijs, The Epistemology of the Unspoken on the Concept of Tacit Knowledge in Contemporary Design Research, and Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledge. Claudia Marijs, she brought up a number of connected terms connected to tacit knowledge, such as experiential knowledge, situated cognition, or sensuous knowledge. And also Donna Haraway spoke of situated knowledge, emphasizing that knowledge is always partial, related to different viewpoints, particular sites, particular contexts, and perspectives. And today I would like to highlight a particular aspect of tacit knowledge, and that's the one of language, or more precisely, literary language in the form of narrative and poetry. And I would argue that it's not through theoretical language, but it's perhaps not through theoretical language, but maybe through literary language that these experiential, sensuous, and situated aspects of knowledge can be expressed. Narratives are able to situate objects and practices in temporal, spatial, and social contexts, to tell about habits, to tell about rituals specific to a certain place or community. While poetic language often focuses on the complexities and ambiguities of experience. So if theoretical academic language may not always be able to capture the unspoken, the tacit knowledge, it may be literary language that may be able to do so, offering a mediating position between theory and practice, between epistemological reflection and the observation of rituals, habits, and unspoken rules of architecture. Theorists such as Yi-Fu Tuan and Michel de Certeau argued that one should turn to stories in which information about social spatial practices is embedded. Yi-Fu Tuan said in his known books Topophilia, the forceful and precise articulation of environmental attitudes, requires high verbal skills. Literature, rather than social science, provides us with the detailed and finely shaded information on how individuals perceive their worlds. So indeed, he says it's not in these social science theories, but rather in literature, in novels and poetry, that we find these detailed descriptions of how people relate to places, how they perceive their worlds. Similarly, Michel de Certeau, in The Practice of Everyday Life, also argued that we should look to stories when we are interested in these practices that are difficult to trace, that are difficult to pin down. And he said, shouldn't we recognize the narrative scientific legitimacy by assuming that a theory of narration is indissociable from a theory of practices, as its condition as well as its production? To do that would be to recognize the theoretical value of the novel. So indeed, he also says there is so much information embedded in stories about how people use places, how they have installed rituals, trajectories, practices in their everyday life. And it's through stories that we can tell about these practices. So he states that actually within novels, there's so much knowledge embedded about these kind of practices that we should actually recognize their scientific value, or theoretical value, if you will. More recently, Alberto Pérez Gómez, in his recent book Attunement of 2016, also made a plea to take serious the importance of literary language in architecture in the form of narratives, and also specifically poetic narratives. Literary devices such as narrative and poetic descriptions are helpful in acknowledging different layers and perceptions of social and spatial cultures. And these devices can address the urban environment as a complex expression of social, historical, material, and temporal relations between people and their urban environment. And approaching the question of local urban cultures with a literary lens thus offers the possibility to understand not only how urban places are experienced, but also how they can be produced. And these are just a number of publications, and Angelika mentioned already a few of those urban literacy writing plays, but also more recent with Oase, the issue we made on narrating urban places and how narratives can be instrumental in understanding urban landscapes. And the other book is Reading Architecture, edited by my colleague Angelika Scioli. So this observation that we can learn from the relationship between people and places is also driving the cost action Writing Urban Places that I am leading. It's a big European network where we are investigating how narrative techniques can help us to better understand the relationship communities have with their environment. And from there to develop methods that can further articulate those narratives within architectural and urban design practices. So its premise is that it is through literary devices that urban stories and cultures can be shared and further be raised to the level of urban and architectural strategies and concrete democratic political action. So a cost network is a big European network, which is not only international, but also interdisciplinary. So we have some 200 members from many different European cities, and from many different disciplines, from architecture to literary theory, but also media studies, sociology, anthropology, and so on and so forth. We're engaging in field work in different European mid-sized cities, and these are just a few of the cities that we're studying at this moment, or that people within the team are studying through these narrative approaches. So, and the other thing that we do, of course, is bringing together methodological and theoretical inquiries in publications. So these are just a few that I would like to briefly show. The Writing Place journal, this is issue 5 that we made with the COST network. It's called Narrative Methods for Writing Urban Places. So this is more like a methodological reflection where a number of articles show how different narrative methods are brought together. This is one about the city of Limerick with Luke Powell's about visual essays, and Anna Ryan Maloney about literature, so combining photography and literature. And this is one that maybe relates a bit to tacit knowledge in a sense of drawing and writing as a mode to address maybe non-rational structures and unknowing or intuitive aspects of architecture by Victoria Bogdanova. And in the issue number 6, we speak of meaningfulness, appropriation, and integration, 3 key themes within this investigation into the role of urban narratives. This is an article about Riga, the harbor area of Riga, and how these local communities are dealing with all the borders that are imposed through these harbor power structures and practices. And looking at these also through narrative inquiry. And this is another one about housing and this idea of dwelling as a poetic practice in relation to appropriation. I'm not going to go into detail, but just to tell you a bit of the scope of that network on writing urban places and looking at urban communities and urban sites through narrative. But what I want to do in the remaining part of this talk is to give you 2 examples of how literary language and particularly narrative can be useful in architectural and urban investigation, and particularly, as we agreed with Janina, who will give the second lecture, in architectural education. So first, I will show an educational project in Tampere, Finland, that illustrates how narrative and poetic language can be a source for architects to understand local spatial practices and memories, and how it can be a tool to imagine new situations. And second, after discussing how narrative can be used to understand practices of communities, I will turn to communities of practice and taking the School of Architecture and Design in Valparaiso as example. So first, we'll go to the north, to Tampere, in south middle Finland. It's at the moment it's freezing over there, so this image would be completely white if we would show it today. This is the city of Tampere. It's located between 2 lakes, and there is a river and a rapid connecting these 2 lakes, which made it an important industrial city because there was water power in the 19th century. In autumn 2017, when I was visiting professor there in Tampere, the course that I was teaching, which was one of the courses in the Master of Architectural Design, investigated the area of Amuri. That's one, let me see, particular urban area, residential area in the city of Tampere through the thematic lens of memory of place. The studio involved narrative tools to study the area, and also looked at literary sources. Here we see some of the old wooden residential blocks that I will come back to in more detail, and then the more recent apartment blocks in the area. And here we see one of the analytical drawings of the students, where they show the original structure of these wooden residential workers' houses with big courtyards, very specific typology of the industrial city in Finland at the time, and nowadays these big urban blocks. So several literary sources were used, including the novel Musta Rakhaus, Dark Love, by the Tampere-based author Vaino Linna. The book is from 1948. And the atmosphere of these wooden residential neighborhoods was really vividly described by this author. So here, I'll quote from him, "Here the street was lined by old yellow-colored wooden houses, which were always half asleep, as if it didn't make any difference to them what happened inside or outside their walls. In the yards of the houses, one could see children playing and laundry hanging on lines to dry, a view that easily tells about the wealth, gender, and age of the inhabitants. In these blocks lived predominantly workers' families that earned their living in those big factories that gave the street its name. So indeed, these were really factory run villages almost. The whole neighborhood was related to one big factory on one of the lakes. And here, one of the blocks is still existing, and they kept the main structure and some of the old apartments as a museum today. So it seems indeed that in summer, these shared courtyards of the building blocks were really the locus of collective life. And remarkably, the same imagery could be, I just show a bit more of this courtyards, how they are today. So people were really living around the collective courtyard. In the houses, there was really no facilities. You lived around a shared kitchen, but there was a sauna and laundry rooms, and wood storage and so on was all shared in the courtyard. So here you see the entrance hall of these wooden buildings was always a kitchen, and of course there were different periods where they were more or less advanced. And then in one of those buildings there would be 4 rooms where 4 different families would live. Usually quite flexible furniture, so that the living room could be a bedroom at night and so on. And remarkably, the same imagery that we found in Lina's novel and in this museum was also found in some of the poems that we read about the area. And this is Olavi Koskinen, one of the former residents who had lived in this area during his childhood in the 1920s and 1930s, which really captures the materiality, the life in the courtyards, the laundry hanging out to dry, and so on and so forth. So the students paired such historical accounts from the novels and poems with their own observations about materiality, but also about the influence of the seasons, for instance. But also they spoke with inhabitants trying to trace stories and memories about the area. This was a map that they made, a memory map, where they had a number of interviews with different inhabitants and tried to locate some of these memories to the area and see whether some places provoke positive or negative memories, if there are places where people's collective memories were particularly evident, and so on. And from this first analysis, they moved to the social spatial practices, to how daily life took place in the area, how people used the place, which daily trajectories can we discover through these stories, and are they in some way still related to the everyday life in the area in earlier times. So some students even took the idea of the character and the narrative one step further, starting to describe the selected sites from within, taking the houses or the buildings themselves as a character, almost interviewing the objects rather than the people. One of the students wondered what this one old wooden block would say if it could talk. How does it see itself and the people? So one of the texts that you see here, small in the slide, was this: I have been here among the first. I have seen how the area around me has changed over the decades. Before, I was in equal height with my neighbors, and we all looked similar. We were together tightly. In the past, I could see the street with horses, and now I see cars and bikes. What a busy life nowadays. Now I'm the lonely one among the younger buildings that are bigger and taller than me. Me and my friends in this block are the last pieces of old Amory area. I'm now a cafe called Amory in Helmi, but before I served as a home to many working class families and other residents. Maybe I wasn't as modern as the concrete buildings that came after me. I wasn't always considered as cool as I am now. Maybe in different times, some things have different values. And then continuing with that idea of buildings as characters, students also started to imagine how literary texts and narratives could evoke atmospheres of new architectural interventions, and could also generate programs and think of new spatial practices that could take place. So this was one of the students who in the end proposed a community center in this area, and again using these same narrative structures to set her program. So this encounter with the local narratives, both through literary sources and on-site interviews, made the students aware of the role the place plays in the everyday life of its inhabitants, of its history, and of the relation to other parts of the city, such as the factories and so on. So this may provide an example of how a combination of physical and literary readings of an urban area that has undergone different stages of transformation may reveal valuable traces of urban history. The last few minutes of my talk, if I may, Angelika, I think I have a few more minutes. I would like to touch upon another practice and indeed move to the communities of practice of a very specific school, namely the School of Architecture and Design in Valparaiso, Chile. This is a very particular school where poetry and to a lesser extent also theater have been really at the foundational practices of the School of Architecture. Tom and myself have been very lucky to have a PhD candidate who just last week defended his PhD, Oscar Andrade Castro, who worked on this topic for several years and who was himself also connected to this school. So this is one of the articles that was published in an earlier issue of the Writing Place journal about this presence of poetry and what they called the poetic act as a very prominent part of architectural practice at the school. Maybe it's good to know the school has this, it's in Valparaiso in Chile at the coast, and they actually have a big terrain at the coast side with dunes and a forest and hills where they can actually practice on site. They have built part of their classrooms, some houses, some workshops, and so on this site. So the presence on site and being able to work on site is very, very important. But how do you study such a practice when it's very ephemeral, when it's about poems that are not even written down, but it's a poetic act, something that's spoken and then a project appears or it disappears. So it was very difficult to reflect on these practices of education and practice when there's not much. Well, there's a lot in the archives, but there's no detailed theoretical reflection. There's no reports or rules, but there's a lot of objects and poems and drawings. So how do you make sense of that? And this is the cover of the PhD of Oscar. And what he did was to study this. The pedagogies of the school through stories, through memories, through projects, he had, of course, a lot of contacts at the school. So it was also about talks and correspondences with members of the school, hearing about past projects and participating in more recent projects. Here, one of the lower images is of exhibition only a few years ago in Kassel. So there's practices that are ongoing and that he was able to be part of. And another thing that he did, and that's why I like to present it here as well, is also by following these practices and procedures of the school from the outside. And that's where we came in, Tom and myself and our students, where we were invited from Delft to run a studio with our students from TU Delft, following part of these pedagogical structures of the school in Valparaiso. And here you see the members of the school in different times in history working on site in this terrain that they have in Valparaiso. Here we move back to Delft. This is our group of students, and the pages are taken from Oscar's PhD. So what we did with our studio was to actually follow some of the procedures and practices that they used in the pedagogical practice of Valparaiso. One of which was a kind of form study exercise where they worked with very abstract forms and shapes, and they had to make in the end a model that you see here on the right-hand side, which is called the pormenor, a structural wood detail that took into account some spatial ideas, spatial concepts that the students discussed together. And we asked the students to take that object with them in their suitcase to Valparaiso, to Chile. And in the lower picture, last picture here on the slide, you see the students searching for the location of that object, where it would land in the terrain of the Ciudad Abierta, the open city that was the terrain of the school in Valparaiso. Here you see our students at this terrain, working together and starting to build structures in this landscape. There were 3 of those, installations, spatial installations built in the open city in Ciudad Abierta by 3 groups of our students. And in these structures, they were given shape by the landscape itself and this kind of very specific characteristic of that landscape, and these models that they brought from Delft, these spatial ideas that were somehow integrated in these installations. So for the students and for us as well, it was really a confrontation with another type of pedagogical approach by being completely embedded in this. As poetry was part of that, it was of course my role at some point to also sleep in one of the small houses in this on this site, which was called the Cabin of the Poet. So I had to stay there. So of course, in the next day, I had to read everything that was produced at that site. So here I was reading poems to the students. So we were really kind of part of that way of doing, that way of working of that school. And here our students on one of the other sites at their installation, where the models that they brought from Delft and their responses to the place were brought together. One of the projects that came out of this, and this will be the end of my last few slides of my lecture, was a really fantastic project, I have to say, of Devant Asavla. He was one of our students, and he made a very, very beautiful proposal for a winery and adobe building workshop in the valley of Valparaiso. And indeed, making use again of these narratives of social and social practices and these existing resources in the site. One of the sources of inspiration was again in language. Here we see an image of the house of Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, and a text by Pablo Neruda about the stairs of the city. The city it's at the sea, but it's has several big hills, and a big part of the experience of the city is going up and down the stairs endlessly to move beyond between the higher and the lower part of the city. I won't read it here because of lack of time, I think, but beautiful reflection of Neruda about this verticality of the city. And another source of inspiration was local building practices that the students encountered. Here's our students together with the local building workshop, building with Adobe. There was a lot of challenges with erosion, with earthquakes and fire. So there was a lot of rebuilding of the city going on, and they were interested in these, let's say, these vernacular ways of building that were perhaps also more resistant to the earthquake. So this was also one of the sources of inspiration, these local practices of building. So what he did for one of the quite dilapidated neighborhoods in the city was to think of the project as a kind of the city as a kind of organism, and the project as bringing back or revitalizing some vital organs by making use of two local practices that were a bit neglected. One was indeed this adobe building, and the other one was winemaking. So what he proposed was a revitalization of the area, also in terms of the landscape, by reusing these eroded slopes of the hill as a winery. So there was a whole project about making terraces and gradually replanting the area, and thinking of this whole process of winemaking, and also of the process of adobe production. Here's some images of his projects. So the building became a kind of almost landscape factory, where also the water was collected from the slopes and was used again to give power to the factory, and then again to help building the landscape. And here you see some of the outcoming drawings of how this new factory, making use of local resources, both spatial and social resources, provided a new life to this urban area. I will stop here and give the floor back to Angelika and to Janina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaske. That was great to learn from literary language and architecture. And also, I forgot to say that you also wanted to talk about pedagogy, about teaching in architecture, and how this might inspire also teaching. And I think that will hopefully raise a lot of questions. I forgot to say in the beginning, of course, the audience here in Zoom, but also on YouTube, you are always invited to ask questions to both lecturers. And yes, if you have already a quick question to Klaske, I would ask you to ask this question right now. I don't know. I don't see the. Sorry, I do not see the YouTube part. So I'm always depending on Martin, who's telling me whether there is a question on YouTube or not. If not, so I will hand over to Janina, the second lecture, and afterwards they will both have a talk. And of course, again, I will also encourage you, the audience, to ask questions to both. Janina Gosseye will also talk about narrative, but correct me when I'm wrong, but maybe not so much from the literary point of view, but about narratives as such, and how they might create or shape codes and conventions also when we communicate on architecture in the public, but also in teaching. So we will see another aspect of this part of narratives and architecture. So Janina, Professor Janina Gosseye is also at the moment currently teaching in Delft. Oh, okay, so I thought there might be a question. Okay, so Janina is also teaching at Delft currently. She's Associate Professor of Urban Architecture, also at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at the Technical University Delft. And her research is situated, this is part of the website, at the nexus of architectural theory, urban design history, and social and political history. And she also has published in many international journals, also including the Journal of Architecture, the Journal of Urban History and Planning Perspective. She has also edited and authored several books, including Shopping Towns, Europe 1945 until 75, Commercial Collectivity and the Architecture of the Shopping Center, together with Tom Avermaet. It came out in 2017, is that correct? Yeah, and speaking of buildings, oral history and architectural research, together with Naomi Stedt and Deborah van der Plaat. This came out in 2019. And Activism at Home, Architects Dwelling Between Politics, Aesthetics and Resistance, together with Isabelle Doucet, just recently, came out recently. So, and there's also another announcement of a book. I don't know whether it came out already or not, Urban Design in the 20th Century, a history, also together with Tom Avermaet. Is it already published?
Yes, last month.
Okay, so, okay, very, very fresh, yeah. So I'm happy, Janina, that you are here, and I will give you the floor, hand over, and please, we are looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Angelika. I'll just first try to do this, and then this, and now I have to share the sound. Okay. Yeah, I hope that this is all working and that you can see the screen. Oh, I see a thumbs up from Martin, so that is good. So good evening, and thank you very much, Angelika, and also Eva, for the very kind invitation to join you this evening at this joint ICA and TACK event. It is a pleasure to be here virtually, but I must admit that I am quite nervous, because it cannot be denied that there is a certain impossibility about speaking of tacit knowledge. And the title that Klaske and I have devised for our joint talk, so Narratives of Tacit Knowledge, is a sort of contradictio in terminis. Last weekend, in between preparing for this lecture, I watched the Netflix documentary What Happened, Miss Simone. And the anguish that I felt and feel in trying to speak about tacit knowledge, I think, is beautifully captured in this short segment.
It's like, how do you tell somebody how it feels to be in love? How are you going to tell anybody who has not been in love how it feels to be in love? You cannot do it to save your life. You can describe things, but you can't tell them. But you know it when it happens.
Now, this evening I will not try to tell you what it feels like to be in love, but I will try my very best to tell you a bit about tacit knowledge in architecture, and particularly about the realms in which it operates and how we might be able to recognize it. So what you see here is a generic timeline for a building project that shows the various groups of actors that are commonly involved at particular points in time in the realization of a building project. And broadly speaking, each of these groups of actors possesses knowledge, both explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge, that is of import to the building project, and that they thus need to convey to the other groups of actors in order to realize that project. Now, as considering all these various groups of actors and the tacit knowledge that they hold, and in one way or another exchange between each other, is far too complex for a 20-minute talk, I will limit myself to looking at one group or one community of actors, and that is the architect or architects in general. But it has to be pointed out that even this community of architects is not homogeneous. The tacit knowledge that architects possess varies across the globe, as it is, of course, informed by social, cultural, climatic, political, and other variations that occur across our globe. And even when we home in on one particular architectural community, such as the Australian architectural community, which will be the subject of my talk, the factor of time still plays an important role as well, because not only knowledge about how to build evolves through time, but also knowledge about what architecture is, how it should be practiced, and how architects should position themselves in society. In his 1971 book, The Making of a Profession, Australian architectural historian John Maxwell Friedland described the evolution of the profession of architecture in the country, in Australia, from British settlement, which started in the late 18th century, to the late 1960s, when Friedland wrote his book. And Friedland summarizes this evolution that took place over these 150 years as follows. Quote, "From the grudging hands of unwilling convicts, Australia's building passed to opportunistic but unlettered craftsmen, thence to ambitious trades, contractor architects, and eventually to the smooth hands of the professional gentleman. The gentleman architect became the artist architect, who in turn, in response to bewildering imperatives in a rapidly changing world, the technologist businessman architect. And much of the color and the fun and the adventure was squeezed out of architecture as it became a serious business, unquote. Now, I would argue that each of these categories of architects identified by Friedland represents a specific community of tacit knowledge that holds particular beliefs about what architecture is, how it should be practiced, and how architects should position themselves in society. Now, although the quote by Friedland suggests that the transition from one such community to another was smooth, I should point out that this was often not the case, and that in transition periods, these different communities often clashed. And it is interesting to look at the clashes between these different communities because, as Hamish Lonergan, who's one of the PhD candidates working on the TACK project, has argued, it is in the encounter between communities that tacit knowledge sort of comes to the surface and that we can pinpoint what is tacitly held by these communities. So in this talk, I will focus on this last period, marked in yellow here, which is situated around the late 1960s. And at this point in time, a new community of tacit knowledge formed in Australia through its opposition to the ideas and beliefs that were held by this community of businessmen architects that had by then become well established. And my narrative of tacit knowledge is situated in the city of Brisbane, and you see the city of Brisbane here, and Brisbane is the capital of the state of Queensland, and I'm sort of outlining the state of Queensland here and now. And in Brisbane, between 1967 and 1972, architecture students staged a series of dissenting events that challenged not only their outdated architectural education and the rigidity of the local architectural establishment, but that also opposed the reactionary Queensland government and the Vietnam War. And the events that the students organized confronted the establishment both in explicit and in implicit manners, and in doing so, they conceived of an architecture with new social and cultural values and a different role for the architect in society. My narrative begins on September 8, 1967, when one of the largest protest marches in Queensland's history took place. That day, 4,000 students marched some 5 kilometers from the University of Queensland's premises to Brisbane city centre, demanding an end to conscription for the Vietnam War and, as you can see on the sign here, wider civil liberties. Now, this march of the students was organized alphabetically by faculty and then by year cohorts. So they were not quite that anarchic, they were still quite organized in how they organized the march. So this meant that the architecture faculty, A, was in front and the first year students were at the head of the line. So as a result, when the protesters met a wall of police in the city center, as you can see in this image here, almost all the architecture students were arrested because they were at the front of the line. And for many of them, their radicalization began on that day. And this march was among the first in a series of dissenting events that expressed Brisbane architecture students' opposition to Queensland's conservative establishment, which is to be understood in both architectural and political terms. But before I proceed, I'd first like to give you a little bit of background about the city of Brisbane and the state of Queensland. So although Queensland was an early settlement of the British and Australia, it developed more slowly than other Australian states. By the mid-20th century, while Sydney and Melbourne had turned into cosmopolitan cities, the national image of Brisbane remained that of a large country town. And in 1957, a centre-right coalition took government in Queensland, and in 1968, power within this coalition shifted to the more conservative National Party, headed by Johannes Bjelke-Petersen, whom you see here. And under Bjelke-Petersen's premiership, Queensland became a police state in which democratic principles were restricted to privilege the interests of a powerful minority. Freedom of expression was sacrificed to oppressive censorship, and civil liberties were derided as a dangerous ploy of extremists. And in response to Bjelke-Petersen's despotic conservatism, the radical spirit in the state deepened, and the University of Queensland became a hotspot of social and political dissent. And here the architecture students led the charge because they were not only irritated by the oppressive political climate, but also peeved by their outdated education that was leading them towards a largely conformist and business-minded architectural establishment. And architectural education had made quite a slow start in Queensland. It was not until 1938 that the University of Queensland began to develop a full-time course in architecture, when Robert Cummings was appointed as the university's first lecturer in architecture. And in his courses, Cummings, who you see here, religiously followed Bannister Fletcher's A History of Architecture, which meant that he placed the buildings of Dutch architect Willem Dudok as a final development of an architectural truth first revealed to the ancient Egyptians and Greeks. And on the left-hand side here, you see the famous tree of architecture diagram, which is featured on the opening page of the original Bannister Fletcher. And at the bottom, you sort of have the Greek and the Egyptians, and then near the top, you have this sort of soft early modernism of the early 20th century. And through to the late 1960s, Cummings continued to give sermons on this canon of architecture that he believed to have been completed by his generation. But by then, the architectural landscape had, of course, changed. For architecture students who were fascinated by Archigram, Buckminster Fuller, and Bernard Rudofsky, the stereometric forms promoted by Cummings and built across Brisbane by a largely complacent and also largely business-minded local architecture community looked heavy and out of date. So in May 1967, a few months before the civil liberties protest took place, the different beliefs about architecture and the position of the architect in society held by the architectural establishment on the one hand and by Brisbane's architecture students on the other hand became starkly apparent when both the National Architecture Student Conference and the Royal Australian Institute of Architects Conference were held in Brisbane. And you see the poster of the student conference on the right, and then you see a photograph of the Institute Conference on the left. So at the Royal Australian Institute of Architects Conference, Robert Cummings, along with the principals of Queensland's architecture firms, hosted their interstate peers and hobnobbed with elected officials and business leaders in dinner jackets and ceremonial chains of office. The event was very different from the student conference, which was set up as a subversive response to the Institute Conference. The student conference was announced with an image of Ron Heron's 1964 design for a walking city, which immediately clarified that, like Archigram, Brisbane's architecture students intended to inject noise into the system. And the student conference ran for a week, so from May 20th to May 27, 1967, and offered not only lectures and discussions, but also work sessions, exhibitions, and site visits. And for the event, as you may have already noticed in the program here, the students had invited, amongst others, the by then aging Gio Ponti, editor of Domus, and the young avant-gardist Tony Gwilliam from the AA School in London. Now, while Ponti pontificated about the poetry of architecture during the student conference, Gwilliam launched a plea to talk about building rather than architecture, advocating the need for new building materials and new building methods to satisfy the increasing demand for human shelter. And in his workshop, Gwilliam invited the students to create an instant environment with various materials, following which several domes were erected across the University of Queensland campus, and you see these domes here. And the student conference was, as you may have already been able to tell, was very informal in manner, with both students and speakers sitting on the ground, while the evenings were enlivened with barbecues and casual parties. And then on Thursday night, during the conference, the students organized a happening at the Rialto Theatre in Brisbane, which was entitled Dorcas French, a Naughty Review. Planned as a performance art event at Dorcas French, a number of activities took place simultaneously. There was, for instance, a rock band playing in one corner of the venue. Someone was demolishing a car in another. A striptease was enacted elsewhere still inside the Rialto Theatre, and so on. And this happening at the Rialto Theatre actually fed a nascent tradition of architecture reviews that had been initiated 2 years earlier in 1965. And these archi reviews, as they were called, consisted of sketches, music, and experimental theatre, and satirized not only architecture but also politics. And here you see the poster that was prepared for the 1967 Archi Review, which was entitled High on a Hot Banana. And in the 1968 review then, which was called Young Robert Zimmerman, and Robert Zimmerman is the birth name of Bob Dylan. So this 1968 review started with a testimony of the march, referring to the September 1967 protest, where many of the cast of this review had been arrested. It also comprised an act entitled The Soldier, subtitled Thou Shalt Take What Not Belongs to You. So it comprised quite explicit political criticism. And this was significant because in 1969, Bjelke Petersen, the premier, extended his censorship campaign from written publication to the theatre, which implied that in Queensland, people could be prosecuted not only for written prose, but also for onstage utterances. The musical Hair, for instance, famous for its nude scenes, was banned in Brisbane. So the Archie Reviews, which flew under the radar, gave the architecture students a creative outlet that allowed them to critique the oppressive political environment they found themselves in, as well as their deficient architectural education. And these critiques were not always explicitly stated, but also silently enacted, as is shown in the images on the slide here. And then taking place in Brisbane at the same time as the Architecture Student Conference was a small photography exhibition organized by Richard Stringer, who was a young architecture graduate from Melbourne who had moved to Brisbane 4 years earlier. And upon his arrival, Stringer was struck by Queensland's rich architectural heritage, which inspired him to start traveling around the state to photograph these largely forgotten buildings, which he called silent buildings. And then by 1967, Stringer had developed a substantial collection of photographs and organized an exhibition entitled Queensland Background, which was to present, in his words, another side of Queensland beside the sides that the Institute of Architects was presenting. And then the exhibition poster that you see here is indicative of what was presented in the show. It included a photograph of a traditional Queensland house raised on stumps with single-skin timber walls, the structure on the outside, and a pitched tin roof. So with this exhibition, Stringer hoped to offer local architects a testament to the environment that they were operating in and awaken their appreciation of Queensland's built heritage. And these concerns were shared by the Brisbane architecture students who had 2 years earlier, in May 1965, launched a magazine called Scarab. And the first articles of the inaugural issue, such as Rude Forefathers and Non-Pedigree Architecture, launched a plea for a simpler architecture that drew on Queensland's vernacular building tradition. And in the drawings at the bottom of this article here, you see some examples of what they meant by this non-pedigree architecture. So again, it is these simple timber buildings that were raised on stumps and with pitched tin roofs, and these buildings could be found all over Queensland. In the August 1965 issue of Scarab, the students nominated their own Building of the Year, shown on the left, to critique the official Building of the Year, shown on the right, that had been selected by the Institute of Architects. And while these texts in Scarab were undoubtedly influenced by the writings of authors such as Rudowski, but also Sybil Moholy-Nagy, they were also a reaction to the local context, because in Queensland, the concern for place and its history became a particularly poignant issue for these young architects whose training was taking them towards the professional establishment that was busily profiting from these pro-development policies of the Bjelke Petersen government, which at times involved corrupt land rezoning and the destruction of Brisbane's built heritage. It needs to be said that for Bjelke Petersen, he often said that the number of cranes on the skyline were a measure of the state's prosperity, and so demolition became associated with economic growth. Now, Brisbane's architecture students were certainly prolific in their actions. Shortly after they organized a student conference, they also produced a film entitled Happiness is a Three-Legged Dog. And this film melded a critique of the university under capitalism and the oppressive climate with a critique of their retrograde architecture training. Happiness is a Three-Legged Dog is full of statements that express the desire of the students to be free.
Feel that everyone is born with a degree of intuition and creativity, and that this is fostered or suppressed by education and environment.
I'm a bird!
I think in less than half a minute, this sequence quite pitifully conveys the contemporary state of mind of the young architecture students who were distraught not only by the looming threat of conscription into fighting a war that they did not support, but also restrained by their oppressive local political environment. The film, however, did not only critique the contemporary political climate, but also targeted the architectural training and the discipline of architecture in general. In one scene, a lecturer holds up a large print with two images, One depicting an open, sterile office space with desks organized on a grid. The other, a reproduction of Van Gogh's sunflowers. And then when the lecturer asks one of the students which image he believes is better, the student points at the sunflowers, causing all the other students in the room to erupt in laughter. So the film thus clearly takes a stab at the modernist form follows function dogma represented by the well-organized but barren office, and aligns itself with growing criticism that architecture should better respond to people's emotional desires, such as the desire for beauty. And then by the early 1970s, the actions of the architecture students had borne fruit. Finally. At that time, a new cohort of young and energized lecturers was appointed to the University of Queensland School of Architecture. And these new academics determinedly wrought the course away from its stale modernist groundings established by Robert Cummings towards a more varied curriculum that comprised an assortment of creative experiences, including, for instance, pottery, as you can see on the right. In early August 1972, one of these new, young, energized lecturers called Bill Carr organized Art Experience Week, which intended to introduce contemporary art in the curriculum. And for this event, Carr invited several renowned Australian avant-garde artists to Brisbane, including the performance artist Tim Johnson. And Tim Johnson opened Art Week with an event that he called Induction. And for this event, Johnson had written the following instructions for students on the blackboard shown in the back of this photograph here. Quote, lying on your back, attempt to produce an erection, penile or clitoral, by directing your thoughts towards erotic subjects and attempting slight movement of your organ inside your underclothes, unquote. Now, perhaps not surprising, as soon as the head of the School of Architecture heard about this induction event, he ordered Johnson to cease the eroticism and informed the Vice-Chancellor of the university. So within days, the incident was discussed in the Queensland State Parliament, the artist was dismissed, Art Week was cancelled on grounds of immorality, and organizer Bill Carr was brought before the university's dismissals advisory committee. The Art Week controversy also received echoes in the local media. In September 1972, the Courier Mail newspaper, for instance, reported that recently some Queensland University academics and students staged an erotica display before men, women, and children. Everything conceivable was performed: masturbation, homosexuality, sodomy, and sex deviation in full view of everyone there. Now, these exaggerated echoes that Art Week received in the media, which was controlled by Bjelke Petersen, could be understood as an attempt of the government to discredit the University of Queensland, which was a known bulwark of leftist propaganda, and thereby also strengthen the government's own political position. And to a certain extent, this worked. In 1974, Bjelke Petersen once again won the state elections with a landslide victory. And at that time, many of Brisbane's architecture students left for Britain, America, or the more progressive southern Australian states. But some did stick around, and although it took until 1987 for the political climate in Queensland to change, by the late 1970s, this new community of architects had managed to transform Queensland's architectural culture. Based on shared beliefs, rooted in their subversive experiences and actions of the late 1960s and early 1970s, they established a new building culture that was more sympathetic to local traditions. So to conclude, even if it is impossible to pinpoint precisely what was tacitly held by this new generation of architects that stepped onto the scene, what is clear is that between the visits of Tony Gwilliam in 1967 and Tim Johnson in 1972, the project of building modernism as an orthodoxy and the accepted common comportment of the architect as a businessman had been lost to a new architecture community that melded broader social and cultural agendas in their architectural designs. Thank you.
Thank you, Janina. That's fantastic. I missed to say that you stayed for more than 2 years. You also taught in Australia, though. Therefore comes your insight. This is one of the few lectures where I did not know any picture before, so it was completely new to me. So thank you very much for this insightful lecture. And also apologizes to Gennaro. I saw your question to Klaske too late, but However, I come back to your question, Gennaro. Maybe when I start to ask you both, maybe you could also ask yourself each other, because maybe to start this broad topic, maybe I want to ask you whether, in particular, also when I reflect your lecture, Janina. First of all, I thought it is about the narrative of the conservative part, and then it turns out that it's more also about the counter narrative of these subversive students. However, and in your lecture, Klaske, the literary language was also always conceived as being inspiring, bringing architecture, or let's say spatial thinking or spatial thoughts, make it more fruitful. But it could be also a narrative in this more general way, could be also understood as limiting and not only as an enrichment. So maybe this has also to do with Gennaro's question, who also asked whether this might be also used for every kind of art practice. So there is something generic in this topic. Could you just, maybe both of you, could you just explain in which way do you understand it as an inspiring method and not, and could it be distinguished from a more limiting method?
Thanks, Angelika. If I may respond first, I think there's, narrative is of course a very almost kind of container notion in that sense that is used a lot nowadays, and I'm speaking about narrative maybe in a slightly more narrow sense as a literary narrative, as the story in which events happen in time and place, and as a kind of narrative structure in which especially these social and temporal aspects of architecture come to the fore. So I wouldn't speak that easily about the narrative of a place, but rather about multiple narratives of inhabitants, of different viewpoints and so on. So in the very beginning, I spoke of Donna Haraway, who speaks of partial knowledge and partial perspectives. The way that I used narrative, at least in the examples that I showed, was really about thinking about these you could say partial or minor narratives of everyday practices, while I think Janina is talking about a much larger narrative of a school, or rather the story of the school. So in that sense, we interpret that notion in a slightly different way, I would think.
Yeah, well, for me, Klaske, I was really happy that you went first and that you sort of really set the scene, because I really struggled trying to talk about tacit knowledge, and particularly we had chosen narratives, and I thought, my goodness, what have we done? And I really, that's why I chose to sort of go over a sort of narrative that I knew, that I had constructed, and trying to bring that narrative, but show how through bringing that narrative you can sort of see where the tacit knowledge is situated almost. Exactly. So I tried to maybe apply what you were sort of explaining to this case study that I'd already knew quite well. So
that sense is maybe more related to the last story that I shared about the school in Valparaiso, which is also a larger narrative in a way. Yeah. Yes. I was wondering, Janina, you very much focus on Brisbane and Queensland. About the events that happened at the time, social, cultural, political events. But of course, this student conference was 1967. A lot happened around that area, and you did not mention the kind of parallel events in Paris. To what extent were these different narratives related, or were the events in Queensland also influenced by what happened in Paris at the time?
Yeah, I think they're all related. And I was also, because, well, when we prepared for our lecture, I was very happy that you were going to show Valparaiso, because, of course, Valparaiso, the open city, starts in 1970. So, I mean, there's things happening at that point in time where they're trying to experiment also with education. And I think you cannot see it as disconnected. But, well, I haven't studied what students were doing in other areas as well, as I've studied it in Queensland, but I was really surprised by the sort of intensity with which they organized events and lectures and theater and all sorts of things, made a film. And I do think that maybe the intensity was particularly influenced by this political climate that they found themselves in. But of course, you're right, this cannot be disconnected from all these other events that were taking place across the globe, in Paris, in Prague, even in Chile, because I think the fact, but maybe you want to speak to that, the fact that the open city sort of emerged also in this climate of the late 1960s and the 1970s is also quite peculiar or particular, I think.
Yeah, it is a different case in Chile, because they, instead of speaking out in a political sense, they actually withdrew completely. So, well, there was of course a lot of political turmoil in Chile at the time. There was the dictatorship and so on. So there was a lot of protest against. But by withdrawing in this open city and focusing on the site itself and on poetry and so on, they didn't speak about politics, even if we could say it was a political act to turn their backs on everything that was happening in the country and to really focus on architecture as a trade and in almost kind of romantic way. It might also have been a response, but quite a different one than the one that you are showing in Queensland and the ones that happened in Paris, where the students went up to the barricade. Here it was almost the opposite.
May I just take the opportunity, Gennaro? Do you want to ask your question directly? Now he was present, he was visible. Now he's disappeared.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I cannot really activate anymore my video. Maybe.
Okay.
Okay, because it was on and then I disappeared. Yeah, thank you to both Klaske and Janina. I really enjoyed the presentations and the conversation. Yeah, what I wrote, it was mainly addressing Klaske. I was thinking whether the narrative you stress in your presentation as a tool, able to, let's say, go into a complex subject, unpack this unspeakable. If this is not true for almost every creative practices, whether you use photography, for instance, sometimes photography that appears to be the most objective, because I mean, ideally you take what is there, but then you understand that this actually is extremely altering and manipulating the reality and tells and can address and make something coming up and more evident, and probably thinking about our, let's say, craft, drawing. It's also many times when you draw, maybe you sketch, you are on a site, maybe you make a drawing, and this also reveals, somehow brings up some tacit, let's say, knowledge that is embodied in the place. So that, yeah, we could say that there are many paintings, for instance, thinking about the urbanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Gennaro, I agree completely that, of course, it is in many artistic practices that these experiential and sensuous and social aspects of how we relate to the world are expressed. And each of these artistic practices have their own means. Perhaps painting is more present, more engaged with the sensuous and atmospheric, while what the literary narrative has to offer, of course, is the possible, and film as well, is a possibility to jump in time, for instance, and to speak of events and social encounters. So in that sense, yes, I think so. My interest has been particularly in literary narratives and literary language, in what literature can evoke, as a kind of other way of writing than theoretical language, let's say. But yeah, I agree completely that in photography, also the way that things are framed, or the way that things are in or out of focus, etc., it may be able to capture a lot of that kind of knowledge or particular practices that otherwise we wouldn't see.
Thank you.
May I just add one question, because there was one example you showed very briefly, an essay by I did forget the name, about drawing and writing, an essay or
yes.
You remember, it was part of the platform, I guess,
yes.
writing, yeah. And how does it work just concretely? Yeah, because of course everybody wonders probably, because that there is literature.
Yeah, this is
where architecture is described, or maybe also poetically described, but how to convert, how to use literature as a technique.
This is a very particular contribution by Victoria Bogdanova. She just finished her PhD in Ljubljana on the topic of poem drawing. So she is a writer and a drawer and an architect, and she makes beautiful drawings completely intertwined with text.
Mm-hmm.
So she visits, it's about observation basically. So she visits places and then drawings and texts kind of merge together. And she wrote a whole dissertation about this notion of this method of poem drawing and how this was used in the article. It's about Alexander Brodsky, who works on a drawing of the Crystal Palace. And there she explores how this kind of bringing together of writing and drawing for her is a way to express these non-rational or more intuitive aspects of practice. But yes, she says, well, indeed, connected to Gennaro's remark, it's very much about a kind of artistic practice that is very individual to that author, to that artist. And then in her case, she brings that on a more academic level by reflecting on how others combine poems. And it's an interesting, very, very extensive PhD where these different acts of poetry, writing, and drawing come together.
And she creates the stories by herself.
Yes, and also there's an aspect of collective poem drawing where she also published about that with the team she's working on these poem drawings. You can find some of her work in there's this PhD in Ljubljana, and there are some articles in his Writing Place journal. You can find it, Victoria Bogdanova.
Okay, thank you. I just see there is a question by Tim. Tim, do you want to articulate it, or do you want to do it directly?
Because I can. Do you hear me? Yeah, I can. I'd like to say thanks both for fantastic lectures. It was a delight. The question was for Janina, really. And now the chat is so small script, I can't even read what I was going to ask. But the thought was this. The question was, if the clash of communities of practice is a place where you kind of distill or precipitate tacit knowledge, where it becomes visible. I think this is a really beautiful idea. My question was kind of, what kinds of knowledge are we talking about in that example? Because, of course, the students are expressing values. I mean, there are values, sort of opposing, conflicting values being expressed, but those seem to be distinct from knowledges. But the funny thing, the knowledges actually sort of are of, how do you organize a protest, the order in the protest, how you use photography to engage, how you use theatre to engage. And so I thought just was interested in a reflection from your part of if because I also have huge struggles to kind of come to the tacit. But in reviewing this, what do you feel was a knowledge that was distilled or precipitated through those events?
Well, thanks, Tim, for that question. I think it is true. It's mostly to do with values, but I also think there's knowledge operating there as well. And I don't know, because my understanding is that tacit knowledge is not necessarily always knowledge that cannot be made explicit. Sometimes certain communities of tacit knowledge just choose to keep something tacit for the sake of sort of the community, sort of there in the know. And I think in terms of not, because it operated really in various realms. There were values, they were opposing this value of business, architecture as a business, but it was also to do with knowledge in the sense that they thought that their architectural education was deficient and that they should be looking at other things like the archigrams, like the Buckminster Fullers, that it shouldn't be about making beautiful buildings, but it should be about housing for the greatest number. But they'd never, I mean, if you read all these magazines that they did, if you look at Happiness is a three-legged dog in full, the full 35 minutes, they never sort of explicitly say these things. It's all, and I think this also goes back to Gennaro and Klaske's discussion, because I also wanted to show that it is in these sort of theatrical performances, in the photography, in making this film, that it is through these various media that they formulate this critique, which operates in various realms, but it's never explicitly stated, even if they could probably say it explicitly if they wanted. They just don't. They do it through these artistic media and expressions. I hope that responds to your question, more or less.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that's really interesting. The knowledge is actually a knowledge of theatre. I mean, it's other things that are known about by these groups of actors, which enable them to act. And I think that's kind of a useful thing to kind of be able to point to anyway. So yes, I kind of agree. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I find this also a very interesting topic, also in the context of tacit knowledge, that you actually create your narrative by yourself, either with literature or with some parts of literature or by theatrical modes, and maybe by this embodied, sometimes tacit knowledge is also understood as embodied knowledge, and maybe because it's not hidden, it's not something which is hidden, it's just something which is not as, this was really a fantastic piece with Nina Simone, where she was talking about love, or falling in love, which cannot be explained, but you know when it happens, something like that. So this for this reason, I found that also quite interesting to see therefore I find it also interesting to see the conservative narrative, which is very strongly fixed on orthodox morality and politics, and on the other hand a counter narrative, which is in a way using new ways, alternatives, experiments, and so on, in order to come to new developments and new insights in architecture. So this is less a question, but I found it quite, so in that sense, I found this opposition between these two positions, the conservative and the subversive, as you quite insightful. Yeah.
Well, if I may briefly add something, because I tried to condense it into 20 minutes as you asked, but I do think, maybe thinking some more about what Tim was saying, I do think there was also tacit knowledge, and that's why I showed the Art Experience Week and the fact that they did this induction event. I mean, of course, it is fun to show what they made the students do, but I think the exercise was sincere. I think they really, in a way, wanted to sort of reflect upon this unbridgeable divide between the mind and the body by giving the students this task. And that's also, I think, related to architecture, again, this sort of unbridgeable divide between your mind and your body. Can your mind make your body do things? And that's what he was trying to do, I think, through that exercise, Tim Johnson. I think it's interesting. And also when they start with the pottery exercises, I think there is something there about a different kind of knowledge that is maybe more mind-body related, craft related in ways of doing. So I think there is also that part of the knowledge, and I should have said that as well when Tim asked his question.
Yeah. Maybe I just want to remind everyone, also everyone on YouTube, if you have any question, please feel free to ask. Unfortunately, I cannot see the YouTube audience, but I will be informed by your questions. So yeah, I just wanted to remind you that you are welcome with all your questions. Yeah, if nobody else has a question, I would like to continue or ask something to Klaske, which is, you did not, because I know 20 minutes is always very short, but I know that you, in your approach also to this connection between literature and architecture, you used in terms of methodology, the phenomenology, and very, very strongly. And you, as I do understand it, that this is to you very crucial, and you do not deliberately, you do not approach this topic by structuralist methods or any other theoretical methods, even though I could imagine that it would be also interesting to observe this topic from this point of view. So could you maybe explain why you have approached it from this, or why do you approach it from this?
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. Tom has been speaking in the context of our Tacit knowledge network also about these different epistemes and presenting phenomenology as one of them. Indeed, for me, this experiential dimension of architecture is very important. And Janina was also just mentioning this, we experience architecture through our bodies and we make it through our bodies and so on. So this embodied experience of architecture, the role of the senses, atmosphere, detail, it is a topic that I find extremely important, and that indeed to some extent influences my work. But I would not say that's the only epistemological perspective, because I would say as much present is this more praxeology view, where that's where the narratives actually come in. Perhaps the phenomenology is much more towards poetic language and descriptive language, and these descriptions of sensory perceptions and so on, while in narratives it's about encounter, and it's about the social, and about how people relate to place and to each other, about the different voices and so on. So there it's much more, I was referring to Michel de Certeau about social spatial practices. So I think there's perhaps these two, the phenomenological and the praxeological, are very much intertwined in the work, and then there's of course whenever you talk about language, you also talk about meaning and semiotics and so on. So I wouldn't say that my work would be strictly phenomenological, but I do think that is a big one of the foundational aspects of it. But I would say that this narrative approach, it touches also very much upon the social, and also upon this aspect of semiotics and meaning.
Mm-hmm. But if I was also asking because throughout the last month, in particular also when we met all together, the Tacit Knowledge Network in Wuppertal in October, it came into my mind that it would be, for example, if we would approach tacit knowledge, let's say, for example, through Marxism, by reflecting the critique of ideology in architecture, so to say, which was, by the way, would be very common in the 1960s and 70s. I don't know whether these Brisbane architecture students were approaching their topics with Marxism. I don't know how Marxism is common in Australia, but however, this is a completely different view. And then you always, you look at the appearances always with this perspective that they are lying, they are illusion, that they do not, that they do hide something which has to be discovered, so therefore I was always wondering whether tacit knowledge might be also understood from that perspective, or is it just something completely different? Therefore I was wondering why you focus on phenomenology, which is focusing on these appearances, which also takes them seriously. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I understand what you mean, but the Marxist approach is, I don't know if Eric is around, because I think Eric is doing his PhD within a network from also perhaps more Marxist theory background, thinking also about tacit knowledge and practices in terms of labor. That has not been, at least in my presentation today, not been so much present, but I don't know if Eric wants to respond to that. But yeah, I would say in general, it's healthy to look from different epistemological perspectives and never be limited to only one.
I don't know, Janina, do you think that might be also an approach? I don't know whether you, from an epistemological point of view, how would you approach this specific story you have told us?
Oh, that is a difficult question.
That's maybe
it's quite difficult to respond to, because I think there is a way in which there's a sort of meta-narrative. Is it what the students were doing, or is it how I am looking at what the students were doing that you're trying to get at? Because I think there is a differentiation there that is important. Yeah, I don't think I can respond to that, but I see Tom switch his camera on, so maybe he wants to
Tom, do you want to
jump in?
Jumping in.
No, I think it's a very interesting question, the question of Marxism. I just wanted to remind Angelika that in Marxism, the praxis is, of course, a very important aspect. That's where the revolution is made, let's say. But I wanted to ask to Klaske and to Janina, maybe if I may, Angelika, you had another question. And that is because one of the big resonances that I saw between the two lectures that we have seen tonight is, let's say, in the role that tacit knowledge plays in establishing, and I would even say maintaining, a community of practice. So, for instance, when I'm looking at Klaske speaking about the open city, I think that tacit knowledge plays a very important role in establishing a community of practice, which in that case is an educational community. And I saw, Janina, a very strong link with what you were telling that. And I was wondering if both of you could reflect upon that, because of course, in the network, we're speaking a lot about tacit knowledge, but we also speak about these communities of practice, which are indeed different communities of exchange, different communities of learning, we could say as well. And I was wondering if both of you could shortly reflect upon that. What role does that tacit knowledge play? So not the knowledge that is penned down or printed in books or in lecture notes, but the role of tacit knowledge in establishing and maintaining a community. So that's what I wanted to
exactly. I
ask
think
about.
Thomas, as you are aware, of course, with this Valparaiso case, it's very much embedded in how things are done on site, how things are discussed. There's a big archive with drawings and poems and so on, but there's nothing really pinned down in text so explicitly. So even some of the notions that Oscar was studying, there were different interpretations and different definitions and so on. And it was really also for us, I think, of being there on site and being, well, to some extent, part of these practices and being around in the site and seeing how they do things together and how they work with the terrain and the material, that we started to understand how these decades of knowledge, through doing, through working together, through being there, engaging with the land and the sea, how that established a kind of way of doing, and perhaps also made us understand some of the ways of doing of our colleague in a way of ways of drawing and combining drawing and text and ways of talking that were really part of that whole pedigree of activities that were never really explicit, but that were really recognizable and transferred from one person to the other, I would guess. Yeah,
and in that sense, Klaske, I would also say revises our idea about what education is and what architectural education is as well, because of so I think to me that remains also very fascinating. So maybe I can also hear Janina, because I saw quite a bit of resonance on at that level.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think it's a really good question, because when I think of this community that I try to describe, or the actions of which I try to describe, I think also the knowledge that was tacitly held about what architecture should be about, how an architect should behave, I would actually challenge that everyone in this sort of radical group held the same belief. And I think maybe they didn't make it explicit because the group is not as homogeneous as you might see. They were in agreement what they were against, but what should replace it. And I think maybe that is sort of individual tacit knowledge that is held in the group. And the reason why they do not make it explicit is because it allows this group to have some force, because in the way there's also heterogeneity in this group. There were more Marxist elements in the group, Angelika, to respond to you, and there were others who saw it more as an artistic practice and more on the level of architecture than on politics. So I think some of the things that remain tacit, I think maybe in such a community are also deliberately held tacit in order for the group to stay together.
But it could also be, I mean, that's also a question to both of you, that exactly in the doing, so in the exchange of tacit knowledge in the doing, that in some kind of way more and more consensus is established as well, let's say. So that also happens, of course, that in the doing together, in the collective undertaking, exchanging, in the collective rituals, let's say, that some kind of a common understanding is established as well, I would say.
But I think there is where our communities differ, I think, in the Valparaiso one, because I think what bound my community is that they're reacting against something, and as soon as you take the thing they're reacting against away, the sort of raison d'être of the community sort of dissipates. And I think Valparaiso, as Klaske said, has less of these political undertones, and it was more of an ethos of praxis than of an ethos of reacting. So
yes, yeah. And also this notion of consent, everything was done in common, so there was not a single authorship. It's interesting to think of a school of architecture where you're trained to do everything collectively and where there's no authorship. There's not one student who does one project, but everything is done in common. And they have this whole idea of consent, that everything is decided in common. There's no voting or anything. It's just everyone agrees and this is the way to go. So yeah, for us, that's interesting to see how this...
To me, it's also interesting to see that when we speak about tacit knowledge in these bigger groups, in these communities of practice, as we call them, that there seems to be indeed a sort of interesting field of tension between individually held tacit knowledge and collectively held tacit knowledge, and the way that is played and activated, I would say as well. So to me, that's a very interesting finding after your lectures, I would say as well.
Yeah. But this is again the moment when it also could become a conservative or a limiting part, even if you want to develop or engage new alternatives, because this narrative, which is implicitly created through a community, might become also a limiting narrative in a way, also in another direction. So this is something which is the tension maybe of which you were talking about as well.
Yeah, when the interest in ways of doing becomes something like this is how we always do it and how it should be done.
May I just ask one, maybe I know that it's also maybe a more general question, but there is an interesting parallel to your topic on narratives, which is already written in the 1970s, I think, not about architecture, but the historical sciences by, you probably know it, by Hayden White, Meta History, where he proved that every so-called or apparent scientific and always wanted to be objective science on history is basically structured by literature, so to say, by some typical literature format, such as the epos and the tragedy and the comedy and so on, or the farce. So is this in this way? Could you also find something in architecture like these kind of formats, let's say literature or narrative formats in architecture? Is architecture then too visual to become a literature in itself?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, how these narrative structures and these age-old narrative structures could be recognized also in these communities of practice. I wouldn't have a clear answer at this moment, but I find it very intriguing. So it would be interesting to figure that out.
Well, it's not a narrative structure, but I always, and Klaske could also notice, I'm a big fan of the graphic novel as a thing in architecture too, because I think it brings together this sort of literary modes or genres and the tool that architects have at their disposal. And I try to explore this in my classes that I run, but it's not a genre, it's a mode.
Yeah, and we see that emerging a lot more in architecture education, these graphic novels, at least in Delft, but I think also in other places, that this bringing together of drawing and text and coming up with scenarios or there was a time that in architecture education, all the projects were rather clean and there were no people, it was not populated. And what we see now in these graphic novels is that everything is populated. There's target groups, there's people who are living in these designs and so on. So I find this emergence of the graphic novel as a design tool or a tool of representation quite a interesting development because it brings in these social aspects that otherwise we wouldn't see in plans and sections.
By the way, I also see that with our students, for example, Unity as a software is largely used, and what we see in architecture, what is always used in literature, but very, very rarely in architecture, the I perspective, from which a lot of novels are written. But architecture always wanted to be rational, objective, from above. Actually, it's for everyone. So to put yourself as a person or a subjective view into the process and show only this very fragmented subjective view is quite new, actually, also encouraged by the software tools. Yeah, maybe if there are no further questions, also the YouTube audience is shy, so to say. I don't know why, but they never ask something, and so yeah, we cannot force them, but it's of course fine. But maybe just to one last question, because Eva, maybe you remember that Eva and me, we once conducted a studio which we called Play Architecture, where we deliberately asked the students to combine literature or sometimes also some written texts by sociologists, where it was mainly about living. It was only focused on living, where in literature, living was described, and we asked them to reproduce that, what was written in literature, in architectural terms or modes or formats, and so to say. But this is just, I want to mention, maybe one time we could show you the results of this studio. It was quite fun. Maybe Eva, do you want to add something to that? No. Okay.
This was too quick for me.
Okay.
But
yeah, this is actually, it's a nice exercise to translate literary descriptions of fictional spaces into architectural representation. There is actually in German, there's a very interesting book that's full of these kind of experiments. It's Winfried Nerdinger. I think it was done by Theo Munchen. Architectuur we see in Hoogesteed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This was an exhibition and also a catalog. Yeah, that's.
Yes, and it was. It also contained work by students who translated or represented fictional spaces. Let's say.
Yeah. Okay. So this was just to have a last say, but Klaske and Janina, I very much thank you for your fantastic talk.